The Biennale and the Australian Film, Television and Radio School would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we record these conversations, the Bidjigal people and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all nations of this land. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are warned that the following podcast may contain images and voices of deceased persons. I'm Grant Mailing, a Bidjigal man from La Perouse, and this is the NIRIN podcast series. NIRIN is the 22nd Biennale of Sydney. It's a First Nation-led exhibition that challenges dominant narratives and provides paths to healing. This is a podcast about our connection to place. In this episode, we revisit the colonial history of the National Art School.
We rise at 6 when the bell rings and roll our blankets neat. Then we pace our cell unseeing till 7 with hypnotised feet. Bolts clank and the iron doors open. Light floods from an iron-barred arch, and we start with a start galvanic at the passionless left, quick march. Down the crooked and winding staircase in the great wrong angular well, like the crooked stairs that of late years we've stumbled down to hell. We empty the tubs and muster and march with a shuffling tread, and we take to the cells our breakfasts of hominy and bread.
In the inner east of Sydney, not far from Oxford Street, lies the National Art School. The National Art School is one of the locations for the 22nd Biennale, NIRIN. It's been a place of education for thousands of students, training artists such as Margaret Olley, Reg Mombassa, and Charles Blackman. But before it became one of our most impressive art institutions, it was one of Sydney's most notorious sites of incarceration, Darlinghurst Gaol. Shedding light on the history of the jail is Deborah Beck, who we've just heard reading Henry Lawson's poem about his time locked up at Darlinghurst. Deborah studied at the National Art School in the 70s and is now their archivist and collections manager. Deborah is also the author of Hope in Hell, a rich visual history of life in Darlinghurst Gaol. Can you describe a day in the life of a prisoner?
The day started with the ringing of the bell, so you can hear that in his poem. And then by 6:30, they were expected to be dressed with their beds all rolled up, hammocks and blankets. And then they carried their toilet pails out to the yards to be emptied at 7 a.m. The roll was called, and they were only called out, their numbers were called, no names were used in the jail. Then they had breakfast in the yards or in their cells. And that consisted generally of one piece of bread and hominy. So hominy is a type of porridge. No tea was allowed, only water. Then they were locked back in their cells at 8, and then off to work between 8 and 10:30, depending on the class. They did different work for different classes. The governor did his daily round at 10:30, and they were locked in their cells for a short lunch from 12 to 1. More work from 1 to 4, and then a small evening meal at 4 p.m. They retrieved their bedding, undressed, and they were searched. Locked in the cells at 4:30 for 14 hours. The men wore rough jackets, waistcoats and trousers with hats. They actually looked quite dapper, but they were homemade clothes. And the shirts had a Darlinghurst Gaol stamp on it and their prisoner number, so no names, of course. The women had drab, shapeless dresses and bonnets. They were just very, very simple clothes. They had no night clothes and had to sleep in their clothes all night, and then the lights were off at 8 p.m. So basically there were long hours of loneliness and boredom. It was a really hard time because it was so monotonous and they had nothing to do.
You mentioned that the first thing they heard was the bells, but what else could they hear throughout the day?
Well, all the surfaces in the jail were hard. There were stone floors, walls, iron doors, hobnail boots walking on stone floors, so the sounds reverberated around the site. Occasionally there were screams for the observation ward or from those getting a flogging, And warders were stationed also around the watchtowers. I suppose this was the nicest sound because they were calling out. The night watchman would call out 9 o'clock, all's well. Every half hour they're calling the time. Apart from this, there's very little outside noise. There's a few cars, and there were such high walls that enclosed them from the city or any of the sounds from outside. They were pretty well enclosed in that.
What could the prisoners smell?
Okay, well, that's a pretty nasty question, but as they were allowed to bathe only once a week, it's likely the humid odours were about the worst thing there. They had, as I mentioned, they had no night clothes, so they had to sleep in their day clothes when it was cold. They had no toilets for most of the jail history, so they had to use the pails in their cells and empty them in the morning. The cesspit was right outside the Forbes Street entrance gates, and that permeated the place with its smell. So it was not till 1891 that a sewerage system was installed with flush toilets, and they were in the yards. So it really was a really horribly smelling place.
Yeah. So men, women and children were living in these conditions. What were they in for?
The women were in for vagrancy, stealing, prostitution, alcoholism, and only one woman was hanged there for murder, although others were in there for murder. Children were another group of prisoners, generally boys, 12 to 14 years. They were in for theft and absconding sometimes. They were kept separate from the men as much as possible. There were no male reformatories in New South Wales for many years, so the boys were in the main prison with the men. The men were in for murder, indecent assault, rape, alcoholism, bushranging, forgery, and robbery with arms. A lot of nasty men in there. Yeah. Life sentences were pretty harsh because they had to do the first 3 years in chains, usually on the roads. So they were very restricted for the first 3 years.
So what kind of effects did this treatment have on people?
So this inhumane treatment tended to send prisoners insane, and they often would end up in hospital or in the observation ward.
Darlinghurst Gaol was also the site of public hangings. Can you describe the mood of these public spectacles? I know a lot of them garnered quite big crowds.
Altogether, there were 76 people hanged at Darlinghurst. The most popular was the hanging of John Knatchbull, who was the son of an aristocrat. The fact that he was the son of a baronet and had been a naval captain seemed to be a draw card for the crowd, but he was also a convicted murderer. On the morning of the execution, a large crowd gathered at dawn, walking across Hyde Park Racecourse towards Woolloomooloo Hill. The crowd, made up of people from all classes of Sydney society, was estimated to have grown to 10,000, and they were kept under control by mounted police. John Knatchbull was hanged on a high scaffold in front of the Darlinghurst Gaol gates, witnessed by this enormous silent crowd at 9 a.m. on Tuesday the 13th of February 1844. And then the crowd dispersed. According to one witness, they had come to Darlinghurst Gaol jesting, but went away chastened.
You were talking about journalists writing about the execution of prisoners when hangings became more private. Can you give us an example of what kind of thing they would get in print?
Yes, many attended the hangings and reported the horrific details in the local papers. J.F. Archibald, editor of the Bulletin, described the double hanging of Captain Moonlight, whose actual name was Andrew George Scott, and his accomplice Thomas Rogan. This is his quote. The executioner took from his pocket the white cap
and rapidly drew it over the head of Scott, who at that instant turned to Rogan, shook hands with him, and said, "Goodbye, Tom." The cap was then drawn over Rogan's head and the rope placed around his neck. The executioners stole softly from their victim's side. The assistant hangman threw his whole weight against the lever, and in a second, Andrew George Scott and Thomas Rogan, with their necks broken, were hanging in midair. There is no sound more appalling than a body falling from the drop. First comes the rattle of the trap. Then, almost instantaneously, the dull, fatal sound caused by the straining of the rope on the beam. It is a sound from which there is no echo, and which is invariably followed by a silence so profound as in itself to suggest death.
End of quote. Archibald was later to be interned himself in the debtors' quarters of Darlinghurst Gaol for non-payment of a fine in a libel case against him. His name also became well known after he left money in his will for the annual Archibald Prize, one of Australia's oldest and best-known art prizes for portraiture.
Deborah, what's an aspect of the site's transformation that you love?
My favourite building is the Cellblock Theatre, which was the women's cell block. So it had a long and terrible history in the jail history, but then it was revitalised in the 1960s as a theatre in Sydney. The small theatre, but avant-garde work was performed there. So many of Australia's famous artists and performers did their first pieces in the Cellblock Theatre in the 60s and 70s. People like John Bell did his first acting in there, some of his first performances. Yvonne Kenny, the opera singer, did her first performance there. Ravi Shankar performed there. Nick Cave. A lot of very, very important people performed in the Cellblock Theatre in the early days. So it was a very special place. It was really mainly the home of avant-garde music. So Peter Sculthorpe wrote music for that, and the International Society for Contemporary Music had its home in the Cellblock Theatre, and there were a lot of new performances of Australian music there.
What makes the site unique in Australia?
It's had an extraordinary history, for the first 100 years as a jail, and the second 100 as a place of education for thousands of students. In fact, in 2022, the National Art School will be celebrating 100 years on the site. So it's unique in that it has had two distinct histories.
And why is that important for people to know?
It basically symbolises a slow transition from the end of an era of the penal colony in Sydney to modernisation of jails, basically, in the early 20th century. So it housed colonial offenders and some of the most notorious criminals and bushrangers in the 19th century. Their stories have become part of our folklore, and the site should be recognised for the important role it played in our history, I think.
What do you feel when you visit the Darlinghurst Gaol today?
Well, because I work there, I go there a lot. And it's really a beautiful place to work in now. Most of the ghosts have gone from the site. But it can still be an eerie place at night after the art students have finished their classes. It's really hard to forget the people hang there. I notice it all the time, having written about it so much. And I often think of the countless others who died from what are called natural causes, from disease and neglect. So there were 76 people hanged, but there were over 450 died on top of that.
You've shared a lot of interesting facts about the jail and the school as it stands today as well. So if people wanted to come and check it out, go for a tour, how can they do that?
We conduct tours of the site outlining the history of the jail itself. They can be booked online via the National Art School website. And also my book, Hope in Hell, The History of Darlinghurst Gaol and the National Art School, is available via the website. So if anybody wanted to read any more, I'd recommend the jail tours. It's very interesting. It's a little restricted in that we are a working art school, but it's also interesting to see how the site has been adapted as an art school from a jail.
Thanks so much for speaking with us, Deborah. If you want more information, you can visit nas.edu.au. The 22nd Biennale is open from the 14th of March to the 8th of June. For more information, visit biennaleofsydney.art.